Number 1.
It's one of the state's biggest murder mysteries. The name of the serial killer is known, but the names of the victims are not. A closer look at the case and how advances in science, along with your help, could identify the victims more than a century later. Niagara is a small farming community of about 50 people on the far western edge of Grand Forks County, but a nightmare is part of this sleepy town's history. If someone says Niagara, you mean that's where that guy buried all those dead people, said Laurel Nabhan, a resident of Niagara, in reference to one of the state's biggest murder mysteries. Serial killer Eugene Butler didn't just bury seeds on his farm, but also bodies. It's a little piece of our history, said Nabhan. History describes Butler as a loner and paranoid. He was eventually committed to an insane asylum in 1906 and died several years later. A few years after his passing, while tearing down a house where this workshop stands today, a secret was unlocked. A secret Butler took to the grave. The fact there was that many bodies out at that scene, said Sergeant Dan Hillebrand of the Grand Forks County Sheriff's Department. 6 nude bodies buried in a crawl space underneath the house that could only be accessed through a hidden trapdoor in the floorboards. Some reports say it was a family of 5 plus another victim. Others suggest all the bodies were males between the ages of 15 and 18. All reports indicate the victims were killed with a sharp object, sharp enough to put a hole in their skull. Legs were broken on some of the victims, so they would fit in the shallow graves. I'm assuming it was a rather limited force with a sheriff and possibly a few deputies, said Hillebrand. The sheriff at the time believed the serial killings took place over a period of several years. Since Butler was already dead, the motive remains a mystery. As the story was passed down over the years, many theories have been mentioned. The victims may have been housekeepers who were costing too much, farmhands plotting to rob Butler, or possibly a homosexual relationship that ended violently. The case file is nowhere to be found today. If they existed, they would have been in the courthouse somewhere, in the basement area, and they could have washed away or been destroyed. I'm not even sure they existed back then, just a mystery. What happened to the records, said Hillebrand. The victims were never identified. Police believe Butler burned the clothes to hide their identities. How sad it would be that they were missing, and nobody knew it, or a loved one was looking for them and never found them, said Nabhan. According to newspaper clippings at the time, townspeople who caught wind of the serial killings flocked to the farmstead to collect bones belonging to the victims and took them as souvenirs. So we raised the question, if someone watching this story has one of those bones, could it help identify the victims, even if 100 years have gone by? The probability is high we would be able to extract DNA, because the techniques are dramatically improved now, Phoebe Stubblefield said. Stubblefield is an anthropology professor at the University of North Dakota. She explains even the smallest piece of bone could provide some answers. DNA will give us the same level of specificity. Which population are they descendant from, said Stubblefield. Scientists say the bigger the bone, like a skull or femur, the more useful it would be. Stubblefield would not be surprised if skulls from this event still exist, as they are often kept as trophies. If there is a story attached to that skull, you just keep it, especially the family members will maintain possession. Just keep passing it down and pass the story down, said Stubblefield. But making a positive ID is impossible without a DNA match. Someone has to be looking for the victim. Lately, the odds of finding a match have improved, with more people researching their ancestries and with larger DNA databanks of missing persons. The icing on the cake: will someone come forward and say, I'm missing a relative? Could this be my relative from the early 1900s that we know disappeared, said Stubblefield. A community hoping advances in science could unbury the identities of the 6 murder victims, another piece of our history. Closure definitely, and solve this century-old murder mystery, said Nabhan.
Number 2.
In the age of social media, many police departments, family, and friends of victims have turned to the internet for help in their search for answers. The North Kingstown Police Department and the family of Joanne Lee Reynolds are no exception. In 2012, after the cold case was reopened, a Facebook page was set up to enlist the help of the public in finding new information. Let's go back to where it all began. In 1980, 24-year-old Joanne Reynolds was focused on her future. The year before, she had left the law office where she worked as a receptionist and was taking classes at the local junior college while waiting to be accepted to the University of Rhode Island. She was found murdered in her own home on February 16, the victim of a brutal stabbing earlier that morning. 41 years later, her murder remains shrouded in mystery. Though Joanne's cottage at 1185 10 Rod Road has since been demolished, her memory remains in the hearts and minds of her family, but they aren't the only ones who still seek justice for young Joanne. Detective John Urban is determined to close this cold case, even all these years later. Though there have been many leads over the years, Joanne's killer has remained at large. Detective Urban is hoping that people who might have known her back then will share information they may still be holding close to the chest. Even the smallest things may be of help to him, things people don't really consider pertinent to her case that might be. Where did she hang out? Who were her friends? Anything that might shed a little more light on her life and take him one step closer to closing her case is valuable. The details that we know are that Joanne was found stabbed more than a dozen times with a long-bladed hunting knife sometime between midnight and 10 a.m. on February 16, 1980. There were no signs of forced entry, and it is believed that she may have been attacked by someone she knew, as interviews with friends and neighbors revealed that she was particular about locking her doors. No one saw her with anyone before her murder or heard any noises that can be tied to the attack. The killer left no forensic evidence behind, not even the murder weapon. The cottages where Joanne resided sat behind a larger apartment complex but were fairly well spaced apart, so it's possible that there may have been no witnesses to the crime, especially considering that it was early on a Saturday morning when people weren't headed out to work or may have been sleeping in. After years with no progress in the case, the North Kingston Police Department issued a fresh press release appealing to the public for help in the case. They announced a Facebook page dedicated to her case had been set up to gather any answers people might be able to provide and assured the anonymity of any persons having information in the case. Time has a way of changing things for people. Their allegiance to friends breaks down. They grow older and regret not revealing some detail that might be of use. Perhaps even the killer would like to confess after all these years or has confessed to someone along the way. These possibilities are what give Detective Urban and the family hope that justice will one day be served in this case.
Number 3.
A North Carolina man was arrested Thursday morning and charged in the abduction and death of 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez, who was taken from her home in Lexington, South Carolina, more than 35 years ago. The case had gone unsolved since Jessica disappeared from her home June 6, 1986. Federal and South Carolina law enforcement officials arrived in Lexington County in September to continue investigating the case. Deborah Gutierrez, Jessica's mother, said Friday that she felt relief when she found out that someone had finally been charged in her daughter's disappearance. "I'm glad God brought me to see it," she said. "I prayed he would bring me through it, and we've waited for this a long time." Thomas Eric McDowell, 61, was taken into custody Thursday at 7:50 a.m. at his North White Street home in Wake Forest, North Carolina, by Wake Forest police officers. He is charged with murder, kidnapping and first-degree burglary in connection with Jessica's disappearance, the Lexington County Sheriff's Office said in a news release. McDowell is being held at the Wake County Detention Center in Raleigh on no bond, according to county inmate records. In a court hearing Friday in Wake County, North Carolina, a district court judge said McDowell would remain in jail without bond until he is extradited to South Carolina. In 1986, Deborah Gutierrez woke up to a parent's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't in her room and a window was open. The child's sister said that a man with the magic hat and the beard took her last night. Police investigated the girl's abduction for decades, but no charges were brought before Thursday. The case was reviewed in 2008 and 2015. We took a fresh look at this case in September, when FBI special agents and analysts assigned to its child abduction rapid deployment team and prosecutors with the South Carolina Attorney General's office came to Lexington, said Lexington County Sheriff Jay Kuhn. Arrest warrants confirm that investigators have not found the young girl's body. Agents with the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division also assisted with the investigation, Coons said, and helped review initial reports and interview more than 125 people. In total, agents reviewed more than 3,500 case file pages in September, and 10 FBI field offices were involved. South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson, the state's top law enforcement official, commended investigators and prosecutors from his office for their tireless efforts on the case. "Without this newly discovered information, our office would not be able to prosecute this case." Deborah Gutierrez previously told the state that she had thought of several different potential suspects through the years. Weeks after the girl went missing, a man living in Lexington County, South Carolina, who was a family acquaintance, stole a van and drove to North Carolina, where he raped a woman, she said. He was charged and later convicted and sent to prison. The man later confessed in prison that he had kidnapped a girl in Lexington County. He said he was wearing a tall cowboy when he took the girl. Gutierrez told the state newspaper then, and in 2017, that investigators questioned the man about her daughter's abduction. He offered to tell all in exchange for immunity, but his offer was denied, investigators told her. A spokesperson for the Lexington County Sheriff's Department would not say Thursday whether McDowell was the imprisoned man who reportedly confessed to kidnapping a Lexington girl. McDowell is currently listed on a sex offender registry maintained by SLED, the South Carolina agency, for an offense committed in North Carolina that he was convicted of in March 1987. At the time, McDowell was convicted of second-degree rape and criminal sexual conduct in the second degree and was sentenced to 10 years in prison, according to North Carolina incarceration records. A fingerprint of McDowell's was found in the home where Jessica was abducted, according to warrants. That's one detail from 3 arrest warrants issued for McDowell. The state spoke with Deborah Gutierrez at her home on Friday. She said when she learned that McDowell's fingerprints had matched those found at her then home, she knew McDowell was who had taken her daughter. "I knew his were the only ones on the window because I used to clean those windows every night," she told the state. McDowell was also picked out of a photo lineup as the kidnapper, the warrants say. The documents don't say who picked the photo from the lineup, but Jessica's then 6-year-old sister was in the room when the girl was kidnapped. Also, McDowell made statements to other sources that he had kidnapped Jessica Gutierrez and killed her, the warrants say. The warrants don't indicate when the fingerprint was connected to McDowell nor when he was identified in the photo lineup. It's unclear from the warrants what evidence led to McDowell's arrest Thursday, about 250 miles from where Jessica Gutierrez was abducted. Lexington County Sheriff's Department investigator David Pritchard, who for years has been the lead detective on the case, signed the warrants. In Wake Forest, Tony Parker, who lives down the street and works at a nearby convenience store, said the day after McDowell's arrest that he had seen him around the neighborhood for at least the last 6 or 7 years. In that time, McDowell would keep to himself and didn't talk to others, Parker said. Parker said McDowell drove a white pickup truck and was usually seen leaving his home in the morning and coming back in the evening, not interacting with anyone. Donnie Myers, who was Lexington County's solicitor when Jessica went missing and reviewed evidence from the first investigation, said it was great that police finally made an arrest in the case. McDowell will be prosecuted by the South Carolina Attorney General's office, Coons said. That office has held the case since February 2015. After Thursday's announcement of McDowell's arrest, Coons said his office is looking forward to working with other law enforcement agencies to get justice for Jessica's family and, hopefully, bring her home. Gutierrez's family has been waiting a long time, and we're glad to be a part of another step in the process, Coons said. And the community support to the family and to those who have worked on this case has been invaluable. We know they'll remember Jessica and stand with her family in the coming days. 11th Circuit Solicitor Rick Hubbard said Thursday morning that even though his office is not involved in the case, he will do what he can to make sure there is court space in the Lexington County Courthouse for any hearings that might be held there. "I'm elated they feel they have enough information to move forward," Hubbard said.
Number 4.
This one is sort of close to me as it happened not too far from my childhood home. In 1981, A 30-year-old man by the name of John Mathis lived on a farm outside Mount Vernon in South Dakota. He lived with his 30-year-old wife LaDonna and their 3 children: 4-year-old Brian, 2-year-old Patrick, and 9-month-old Duane. In July of 1981, his farm was hit with 2 house fires, the second of which sadly burned the Mathis home to the ground. While the house was being rebuilt, the family lived together inside a metal shed on the property, while infant Duane stayed with LaDonna's parents. Early in the morning of September 8 of 1981, specifically at 3:54 a.m., John dialed the home of his friend Doug Kirkus, who at the time was chief deputy of the Davison County Sheriff's Office. He claimed that he and his family had been attacked. Kirkus called for help and drove to the farm and arrived at the same time as John's father, Vern Mathis, whom John had also called. John was sitting inside the machine shed with a gunshot wound to his left arm, but other than that he was physically all right. Sadly, the same could not be said for his family. LaDonna, Brian and Patrick were lying dead in the shack, with gunshot wounds in their heads from a .22 caliber rifle. The words "Mathis sucks" were written on the door of the shed in gold paint. John said he had woken around 2 a.m. because Patrick had needed to go to the bathroom. They walked to the outhouse and had returned to the shed when John heard his hogs and dog making noise and being a bother. John would walk to the pig pen when he said a car had arrived on the property. When he got back to the shed, a man in dark clothing carrying a gun would jump on top of John and fight with him. During the scuffle, the gun went off and pierced John's left arm, causing him to pass out. When John awoke up, the attacker had left and his family were shot dead. The local sheriff did not believe the story Mathis had told, and after a grand jury investigation, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, though they were later dropped. Here was the evidence from the circumstantial case against him. The first house fire at the Mathis farm took place around 2:30 a.m. on July 9. LaDonna was awakened by the fire and escaped the house with her 3 children to discover that John was already awake and outside working. It was believed the fire was Mathis's first attempt to murder his family. At the hospital where John was sent, an unfired Winchester .22 shell was found in his pant pocket, which was very similar to the slugs found in the bodies of the victims. John claimed that Patrick had found the shell on his property the night before the murders, and after his son gave it to him, he put the shell in his pocket and forgot about it. Kim Tatum, a 17-year-old neighbor who babysat the Mathis children, testified that John had fondled her on several occasions and told her he wished that they had met before he started courting his wife. When Kim's mother was made aware, she warned John to leave her daughter alone, or she would tell LaDonna. Mathis's wristwatch was broken during his alleged struggle with the attacker, but there were no marks found on his wrist, and 2 jewelers would testify the amount of damage to the watch seemed to indicate it had been hit multiple times. The time on the broken watch read 3:25, even though Mathis claimed that he had woken up somewhere around 2 a.m., and the estimated time of his family's death was 2:30. The only blood found in the area was inside of the shed, even though Mathis claimed his struggle with the attacker took place outside of the shed. The biggest issue with the case was that the murder weapon was never located, even after an extensive search was performed of every square inch of Mathis's property. In addition, the spray can used to paint the message on that was never found. It was rumored that Vern Mathis may have helped his son cover up the crime and was actually returning after disposing of the gun and spray can at the time Deputy Kirkus saw him arrive at the farm. However, no evidence could be found to implicate Vern. In a bizarre turn of events, while outside on a dinner break during the trial, the jury would find a Winchester .22 caliber shell on the sidewalk, which was the same type of shell found in John's pocket. This seemed to plant the idea that just maybe his story about his son finding a .22 shell on the ground wasn't actually quite as unbelievable as it first seemed to be. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury found John Mathis not guilty on all 3 counts of murder and acquitted him. Even though LaDonna's parents still believed John committed these murders, they had no choice but to return his surviving son, Duane, to him. John would go on to live a very quiet life on his farm, raising Duane as a single father. When a 30th anniversary article about the case was published, Duane agreed to be interviewed and insisted that his father did not commit the crime. In his eyes, the fact that John raised him into adulthood and didn't once try to off his remaining son proved he was an innocent man. Indeed, there was never a clear motive for John to have committed the crime, as murdering his wife and sons didn't seem to benefit him in any way, shape or form. Despite this, the authorities always believed Mathis was guilty and never uncovered any evidence pointing to another suspect.
Number 5.
One murder is solved. 4 Jane Does are identified. But other victims in the so-called Redhead murders remain a mystery, as does their killer or killers. When the bodies of multiple young women with red or reddish hair were found discarded near highways in Tennessee, Kentucky and neighboring states between 1983 and 1985, it prompted fears of a serial killer. Police formed a multi-state task force in 1985 to pool information and stop the violence, but it wasn't until 2018 that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation connected the dots in one slaying. New evidence revealed that a redheaded Jane Doe found bound and strangled along Interstate 75 in Campbell County, Tennessee, on January 1, 1985 was Tina Marie McKinney Farmer, the TBI reported. The Indiana native was just 21. In late 2019, a Campbell County grand jury implicated deceased trucker Jerry Leon Johns in Farmer's death. Johns died in prison in 2015 while serving time for aggravated kidnapping and assault. In Farmer's case, evidence sat for a very long period of time, TBI Special Agent Brandon Elkins tells A&E True Crime. Police did all they could do then, but the top-notch technology basically was blood typing, which only provides a circumstantial pattern at best, Elkins says. We were able to resubmit evidence using techniques we currently use, and we were able to obtain DNA evidence that ultimately led to solving the case. With myriad states and police departments involved over 35 years, there's no official consensus on the exact number of Redhead murders. Tallies have ranged from 6 to 11 women. A June 26, 1985, article in the Louisville-based journal Courier cited 8 murders of red-haired females that police speculated were committed by one person. In addition to Tina Farmer, women who have been linked with the Redhead murders include an unknown auburn-haired female found on February 13, 1983, near Route 250 in Wetzel County, West Virginia. Her age was 30 to 45, according to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Lisa Nichols, 28. The West Virginia woman's strangled body was located on September 16, 1984 along Interstate 40 near West Memphis, Arkansas. Nichols, who had strawberry blonde hair, was identified in June of 1985, according to the Courier Journal. An unknown redheaded female found on March 31, 1985 in Cheatham County, Tennessee, along Interstate 24. Her age was between 31 to 20, NamUs estimates. SP Regina Black Pilgrim, 28. The redheaded North Carolina woman's body was found on April 1, 1985, in a refrigerator in a dumping area along Route 25 in Knox County, Kentucky, but not identified until 2018. Elizabeth Lamott, 17. The New Hampshire teen's body was found on April 14, 1985, along Interstate 81 in Greene County, Tennessee. She had been staying at a group home in Manchester. Lamott was identified November 14, 2018. She had dark hair with reddish tints. The police task force that gathered in 1985 to collaborate on the Redhead murders faced a daunting conundrum. At the time, authorities were focusing on 9 to 10 murders of unidentified women, retired TBI Special Agent and former Jefferson County, Tennessee, Sheriff David Davenport tells A&E True Crime. The women were mostly redheads with exception of one brunette, Davenport recalls. They were all found dumped on the side of interstates. Some were wrapped in blankets with duct tape. As to who was responsible, it was always thought at that time that it was a long-distance truck driver. On March 5, 1985, a few months after Farmer's slaying, a young dancer with red hair named Linda Shack was propositioned by a customer at the club where she worked in Knox County, Tennessee. The customer, who later proved to be Jerry Johns, tore up a pair of $100 bills, gave her 2 halves, and promised the remainder when they had sex, authorities said. Instead, later that night, an armed Johns ripped up Shack's t-shirt, bound her and drove to a wooded area near I-40. He strangled her until she passed out, court records show. Amazingly, Shaq survived, and her testimony led to John's conviction in 1987. Police also questioned him about the other murders. He was very cocky and wouldn't admit to anything, recalls Davenport, who interviewed Johns. Anytime we'd get into the motive, or why did you do what you did, he wouldn't answer. In 2016, when Farmer was still unidentified, Elkins submitted her clothing and a blanket from the crime scene to the TBI crime lab. An analysis detected semen that was traced to Jerry Johns through an FBI database. 2 years later, another breakthrough occurred when an entry on a missing persons blog surfaced that listed Farmer by name. Agents found details that matched the Jane Doe from Campbell County, and fingerprint checks confirmed Farmer's identity. Sharing the news with Farmer's family was bittersweet, Elkins recalls. They got some answers. I don't really believe in closure per se, but I do believe in some peace. Putting a name on somebody who deserves a name. In 2018, DNA testing enabled TBI and Kentucky State Police investigators to identify Elizabeth Lamott and S.P. Black Pilgrim, respectively. Was there one or multiple perpetrators targeting redeeded women in the Tennessee region in the mid-1980s? Davenport thinks because of the similarities in all the cases and how they were dumped along the side of the interstate, it was probably done by the same truck driver or traveling person. However, I have to say up front, we've not made a positive connection, at this point, with any other cases with Jerry Johns, besides the Farmer and Shaq cases, Elkins explains. There are redeeded females who have been killed in the state of Tennessee around that time period. But to say, we're connecting the dots on all these cases or they all have to be Jerry Johns, I'm not to that point. I don't know, frankly, if we'll ever be at that point. Asked about the plausibility of a murderer fixated on redeeds, forensic psychologist Joni Johnston tells A&E True Crime the idea that serial killers wait for the perfect victim is overrated. It's true that some sexually motivated serial killers do seem to have a fantasy of an ideal victim based on race, gender, certain physical characteristics or some other special quality. But these preferences evolve over time. At first, a serial killer's victim choice may seem almost random, Johnson says. As his killing career progresses, and he develops confidence in his ability to lure or kidnap a victim, some serial killers narrow down the type of victim they prefer and will stalk a more specific type of victim. Police aren't the only ones trying to shed light on the Redhead murders. 4 years ago, investigative journalist Shane Waters of Indiana began digging into the mystery. He traveled to the locations where 6 victims' bodies were found and planted red crosses there. In 2018, Waters produced a series of podcasts about the Redhead murders. He tells A&E True Crime, "I think the world forgot about these women because they were deemed as throwaways." Waters' crusade connected him with several victims' families and an enterprising sociology class at Elizabethton High School in Tennessee. Students developed a profile of the murderer, whom they concluded was a male trucker frequenting the I-40 corridor. They also coined a nickname, the Bible Belt Strangler, announced at a 2018 press conference with law enforcement. Pilgrim's daughter, Elizabeth, thanked the class, saying, "The hope of one day finding what happened to her has never left my thoughts." As for police, we're not going to stop, Elkins says. We're just going to keep on trying to use the techniques and technologies of today to solve those dusty cases they have waited so long for resolution. If you have information on the Redhead murders, contact the TBI at 1-800-824-3463.